kick it, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of room for interaction, and you have some sense for what this session is about, right? As we're thinking about leadership at a personal level, our own narratives, how they connect to some of these broader principles, how those narratives are evolving. And you've seen their bios. They're all very, very accomplished, so I won't walk you through all of that. I thought I would start, we might just very, very quickly focus on a specific question if there are a couple of other things you want to add for context that comes from your bio. But the question would be, is there something that's not in your bio that you'd like to make sure we all hear? Any little tidbit, something interesting about yourself that would help to kick us off? Cliff, would you start for us?
Yeah. Well, look, most of my life is actually in my bio.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I graduated Haas in '99 undergrad, and actually I've been at Goldman Sachs since then. So basically, my life has been at Goldman Sachs for 14 years. So there's not too much more that I can say about that. I guess an interesting fact that I would share with the group. We do, and I think we still do this, Goldman, we're very active in recruiting Haas students and Berkeley students to Goldman Sachs. And one of the things we've done, I think we've done for the last 15 years, is we do a case study at the undergraduate level with kind of an investment banking case study. So we have teams of 4 compete against each other and do a case on how to value a company or how to think about an IPO of a company, various things like that. And actually, I was the first case that Goldman Sachs done. I was actually the winner of that case 15 years ago, and then helped author 3 or 4 of those cases for the undergrads, helping to recruit when I first joined Goldman Sachs, back 14 years ago or so. So that's a nice factoid that I would share with the group.
Perfect. Thanks. Karen?
I guess I would say that I got interested in business, the undergraduate and the MBA, because I wanted to understand how to frame questions for the public sector to be able to push forward the agenda for maybe public sector issues in a way that the business community could understand it. So I went on then to get an MBA from Kellogg, and basically then spent the time enjoying the financial markets for the next 18 years. But I think it was the public sector that actually drove me into the analysis of the business world.
Please, Richard.
Well, I'm not sure what was put in my bio, but I thought it was very well written, and I'd like to congratulate the school for doing that. But I don't think the reference was made to the fact that I did my undergraduate work at the LSE, so I was very delighted to make an LSE connection here today, as well as a Berkeley one. And my Berkeley connection goes back a very long time to the early 1970s, before the name Haas came into the arena. And delighted to participate in this event today.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, well, my history with Cal goes way back also. I was there as an undergrad back in the 70s, and actually went into Cal originally thinking that I wanted to go to political science and end up in potentially going to law school. And but along the way, I'd heard more and more about the Haas School. I was actually playing football at the time, and was thinking also that maybe there was a career later on in athletics for me. And unfortunately, I was able to get through 3 years of football, but was injured, and ended up having to step out of the sports. But luckily for me, it was that semester, the final year, the final quarter that I was actually playing football, that I was admitted to the Haas School. And from there, I was able to then start focusing a little more attention on my Haas studies, and that helped me later on to eventually get my GPA back up a little bit where I needed to, so that I could progress along into graduate school and law school. So.
Great. And also, I don't know that we'll get to it, but this whole question of what leadership wisdom journals over from the sports world, because we often hear people talking about exemplars of leaders from the sports world, a coach and so forth. Some of those work well in the commercial sector. I think some work less well. Same for the military like to draw lessons, and they aren't always generalizable. How about this question then, just to kind of kick it off at a high level? When we think about what a good leader is, if you had to attach some words to the tail end of a sentence that starts with "a good leader is," are there a few top-level associations each of you have? Why don't we start with you, Richard? A good leader is?
A good leader is someone who, to my mind, owns and articulates the vision in whatever organization one is engaged.
Great. Vision. Fundamental. Any of the rest of you want to kick in next?
Well, probably someone who can put a team together to be able to deliver on that vision, understanding their own limitations and also working to the strengths of other people.
Thank you.
I think also that somebody has the courage to also stick with whatever the vision is that they articulate, and the courage to take the steps necessary, both from either an operational standpoint or from a people standpoint, to make the changes that are necessary to do it. And too often I would see circumstances where people and leaders or managers would be looking to implement a vision, but they just had difficulty for whatever reason sticking to it. And a lot of times there would be political reasons within the company or other things, and it's that has a very distinctive issue with the morale of the company when they start seeing directional issues or directional mandates being kind of issued, and then but no one really following them.
Great example. You may want to come back to that. I love that example. Please, Cliff.
I mean, I think those are all good points. I think the only thing I would add is more of a personality trait, which is, I think, kind of integrity to the vision. So consistency, presenting yourself being a certain way and presenting yourself in a certain way, not wavering too much as you move through different obstacles, but having a pretty consistent vision or way of approaching things.
Yeah. Let's dig into those too, because those are related, right? This idea of a point of view. Do you have one or don't you, right? And then so there's one of the things that people talk a lot about. Maybe this is just sort of the West Coast view on the world, right? But this notion of experimentation, probably the biggest word to hit the world of entrepreneurship these days is pivot, right? Pivot, experiment, run lots of experiments, learn, pivot, which feels like it could run at cross purposes to this idea of let's maintain consistency. So so the current, when you see the lack of courage, do you think of it as organizational roadblocks, pushback, battles people are unwilling to fight, or how do we understand the lack of courage?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that in a lot of large corporations, there are a lot of issues around the political structure that I think some leaders, and again, maybe again, are they true leaders? Are they managers?
Yeah, there you go.
Which I think the distinction there, and in terms of they may be fine at managing a process or some operation, but they aren't. To me, I never felt that they were true leaders because they didn't have the courage of their conviction and they didn't to stick with things. And I think it can become a lot about the people that are part of the management team, some of the politics that go on there, some of the personalities that are in there that drive a lot of decision making that probably, isn't necessarily in the interest of the company or the direction the company should be going. And again, that can be very subjective, and everyone can have different views within the corporation as to what's going on. But I do find that sometimes people in senior positions just get swayed too easily because they don't want to deal with the personality or another issue with respect to the political or operational organization of the company.
Great examples. Other comments on this line?
I think that having a clear vision and consistency is perfectly compatible with a climate and encouragement of innovation in the organisation. In fact, I mean, the bulk of my career was spent with Arthur Andersen, which is a business, and although it suffered a sad demise 3 weeks after I retired, and I don't think there was a link between the two, but it lives on in terms of its culture and Accenture today. A key part of that was clarity of the direction in which you're going, but constantly challenging what you do every day. And the expectation that the people that you bring in will be in that mode and will challenge you and the organisation. And that is a very powerful driver in moving the organisation forward. And we've had a reference earlier to Margaret Thatcher. And for my sins, I've been pretty closely involved in politics here for the last 40 years. And I felt that the thing about Margaret Thatcher was this ability to hold fast to a vision, but at the same time, contrary to a lot of popular characterization of her, she listened. She was somebody who would be challenged and wanted to be challenged. What she didn't respect is people who wouldn't challenge her, who would spend their time blaming others for why things couldn't happen. But that was an important part of her success, I think.
This challenging piece of it, right, is part of that courage tableau. I mean, we talk about questioning the status quo, right? That's a very Berkeley habit of mind. There's got to be a better way to do this, right? We all know that that's part of what we're trying to attract in our admissions. It's one of our defining principles. I was speaking with Rajiv last night, who's here, and we'll be speaking later. He talked about at McKinsey the way they frame that is an obligation to dissent, right? But a lot of very healthy organizations have some kind of a norm that's about challenge, adaptability, pushing back, right? They use different words. But it seems to be a profoundly important renewal force within organizations as a cultural element. In fact, Jenny Chapman, she's one of our faculty members, who's one of the world's great how to manage culture scholars. And she just wrote a paper, she sent it to me about a month ago, and it was on linking strong cultures to performance, to outcomes, okay? Okay. And so that linking of those organizational outcomes, they found that, just reattach this, they found that the link to performance was fundamentally intermediated by what they called an adaptability norm, something in the culture that was about challenging or renewal or questioning. And so there's a lot of literature on this as well.
But there are also a lot of environments that don't encourage the challenge.
Yes.
People, and it gets to a little bit what Constance was just talking about in terms of the approach that a leader will take with respect to their followers. And I think that's a very important consideration when you're looking at people who are true leaders, is they are good listeners. Yes. They do listen and proactively listen, and they listen without filters necessarily. And it was something that I found just in my time at Sony Pictures, that too often, and it's because I was there for 20 plus years, I'd seen a lot. And you get to a point in your career where you feel like, well, you've seen it all. And so people will bring you ideas, and you're thinking, we tried that 5 years ago, and that didn't really work then. And so you're automatically putting this filter on, and you're starting to respond in a very negative way about their idea. And I felt that I really had to step back and listen and say, okay, well, we could try that, and empower the people to go out and attempt to do something. So
I love that phrase, they listen without filters, because that really is, when the principle, I know I keep coming back to these, but when we talk to the students about students always, I almost always present this by saying, it's orientation, it's day one. And I say, will you know, will you realize, will you understand at the end of your career, in your last job, that you still have some developing to do, that you still have feedback to listen to? That is easy to forget, right? So, lifelong learning, got it. But we're talking about something much more nuanced than that. And this is hard. This is hard. Anyways, great thought. Other additions on this? I realize it's quite a big topic. Okay, great. How about this? Let me one thing that we talked a little bit about was some of the things in our curriculum. So I'm going to toss them out. So part of what we've tried to do is be specific. So we have, as I talk about that horizontal segment, the kind of leadership, the integrating part of our curriculum and our experience both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. The culture is an important piece of that. We also tried to think about, look, is there a set of capabilities, a set of real skills that are particularly forward-looking, right? Particularly associated with innovative leadership, with more entrepreneurial, more path-bending way of conducting oneself in their career. What would those look like? And one of the ones that we came up with, I've already mentioned, problem framing, right? We put together a class on problem framing. We felt that was fundamental, that was very forward-looking in how we saw effective leadership and management going forward. Some others that we put in there were influencing without authority or beyond authority. So this is something that's very strong in the management literature. Every business school delivers on that to some degree, but we wanted to create a focal point so that class after class connected to it. And so the students had a different experience through the lens of that capability, influencing beyond authority. So there were 4 of them we were really focusing on: framing problems, influencing without authority. A third one was experimenting to learn, this notion of experimentation as the way one learns in highly dynamic environments. How does that become a leadership skill? And the fourth one was navigating uncertainty or complexity. And we talk a lot about that. So let me toss those 4 out. And if any of you would like to comment on either of those 4, or if you said, wow, I would have thought this would be on the list. There is no list written on a tablet somewhere. But at the end of the day, you got to take a stand. What the hell is your culture? What the hell are you trying to get through your curriculum, right? And these were 4 things that we felt we had the intellectual heft to deliver in a robust way. We also felt that they were particularly important for going forward, not that other things aren't. But any comments on either of those 4 from either of you?
I think framing the question is something that really strikes home. And part of it, everybody, we're trained to problem solve, and everybody has this idea of what your question is and what you need to answer. But oftentimes it's the ability to give a voice or hear the issues from a lot of other people. I think about this often even in small companies where you have sort of the concerns of the finance director, you have the optimism of the CEO, you have unlimited potential from your sales team, and sort of how do you bring all of those things together to be able to actually deliver the product, deliver the organization, to be able to meet what's been set as the objective. Organizations have finite resources. People will often be competing for them. To your point, John, I think that's why you often find people who are often trying to maybe bring more back into their domain at the risk of taking something away from another person. Uncertainty, that's just something that I think is just the nature of the beast. I can't imagine, I was saying this over the past week, trying to imagine what it must be like to be able to go into a role and stay in that role until you actually get your gold watch at retirement, because I think those days are actually gone. The constant learning, the being able to frame the questions, and being able to experiment. But if you're experimenting, it also means that you're taking a risk, and a risk means that you might fail. And so you also have to have a tolerance, I think, within the organization and with the leadership to be able to understand that there will be elements of failure, but what have you learned and what can you do better as a result? So I think these are all really, really key things. The only thing I thought of adding would be, when you're looking at this, what's the organization's capacity, and at what point is the organization as you're applying some of the questions that you're framing? Because different maturity cycles may have different needs in terms of being able to drive the business or shrink the business or reinvent the business.
Interesting. So as a capability or a competency, that notion of being able to evaluate organizational capacity,
Yeah.
And think about what are we as an organization.
Yeah, when you think of organizations, products, even personal, you always are on a different life cycle.
Interesting. Yeah. I think, particularly with transformation programs, change management, things like that, right? Sort of the ability of an organization to withstand more change in some period of time. Could you, was there any, if I could just use fish for one example, if you thought about problem framing and you thought about in the past, were there, I know this is kind of a broad and tough question perhaps, but were there situations where in the past where people have, any of you, people have kind of hit a framing where you say, bang, that is root causes. That's not symptoms. That's right at the center of it. And we were just, we'd been circling and this person got there. Or it could also be something where somebody, again, dials in or out and says, Jack Welch used to say, the General Electric CEO, he used to say, among many things, but I think he was known for saying that, look, don't come in here as one of my business heads and tell me you've got a 70% market share. I want you to come in here and define a market over which you have a 10% market share, and then tell me how you're going to get to 30 or 40, right? In other words, I want a different frame. I need you in a bigger game than you're in right now, right? And that is also a kind of reframe, right? You are not in the soda business. You're in the beverage business, right? Anyways, anything come to mind on the framing side where you heard somebody do something in a business or maybe a deal, Cliff, or something like that where it's tough? But I want to make sure we get explicit because problem framing sounds very interesting, and we have a whole course on it, so we do some very specific things. But the more we have handles on that one, I think the better.
An example, I think is applicable, but it is looking at an issue we are dealing with actually here in the UK, as a matter of fact, on the part of our business, Sony Pictures, is taking packages of feature films and television shows and licensing them out to broadcasters around the world. And we were facing a situation, this goes back a number of years ago, and for those of you in the UK, it was back just at the very start of when Channel 5 started operating in the UK. So that was, I don't know, I guess maybe 10 years, 12 years ago. So Channel 5 was a new entrant into the terrestrial broadcast business in the UK. And Channel 5, starting off, new entrants in any new channel, doesn't have a lot of money to spend at the get-go, for the most part. They were well funded, but they only have a certain amount of money they can spend on programming. As a big studio with big films, we expect a lot of money to come to us as a result of producing all these great films and TV shows that'll work wonderfully well on your broadcast schedule. But we were dealing with a situation where the other broadcasters in the marketplace that we were dealing with were being very, very tough in terms of how much they were willing to spend, because they knew we only had a limited number of places to go because of the nature of how other studios had done their deals, who had committed already to product. So we were really reached a point where we just couldn't get over the hurdle of what we could do on our licensing to get kind of money that we had in the past and that we felt was necessary for these films. So very long setup to that. But the bottom line was, so we were hashing around, okay, how do we do this? What is our business? What should we be looking at? And instead of just looking at it from the standpoint of we are a studio that licenses films to the broadcasters and gets the money from the broadcasters, we had one of our salespeople responsible for the UK looked at it from the standpoint of what is a broadcaster's business? What's the whole ecosystem in terms of we sell the product to the broadcasters, they sell advertising time to the advertisers, and that's basically how things flow in the market and how everyone makes their profit. So the idea that this guy came up with was we got to relook at how we do this business. Maybe what we should be doing is approaching the advertisers, talking to them about the relationships they have with the broadcasters. We license our product to the advertiser. Wow. They then go and talk to the broadcaster about what they can do with the product. That's and how terrific. They can then barter the product differently, have a different relationship with the broadcaster. And so we went around and actually got one of the major advertisers in the UK to step up and participate in this, which then kind of broke a whole deadlock, and suddenly, we shocked the other broadcasters that we were actually doing it. And we went to Channel 5 because they didn't have a lot of money, but they did have a lot of airtime. And we came out with the money we needed from the advertiser. The advertiser came up with a stellar deal with Channel 5, and everyone was happy.
Great.
Except for the other
example.
broadcasters who were cutting us out of the market.
That is a
So-
terrific example. Thank you for that, John. That is a terrific example. You know, when you see somebody just go to a different place. There is a company called Better Place very, very quickly. And what, you know, we often think about transportation of electric automobiles, right? It's like, God, if battery efficiency could just get 10 or 20% more effective, right? We'd all be in electric vehicles. And this company, Better Place, basically said, you know, maybe it's not just about a little bit better battery. What if you drove into a filling station and they took your battery out and put a charged battery in? Wow, that's a different framing. Right? Now you need an infrastructure to pull that off, but that's what we all do with our gas grills nowadays, right? Remember 10 years ago when the first time you brought an empty gas grill canister and they handed you a new one, a different one that was full? It's kind of like, what? That's my canister. Why are you taking? Anyway, those are chills down the spine kinds of insights where somebody says, actually, the problem is that, you know, how do we eliminate this need to charge a battery when we might not have time to do it? That's the problem. It's not whether batteries can take a charge faster or not. Anyways, thank you for that. That was a great example. Anybody else wants to toss one in, don't hesitate. But I thought I want anchoring people a bit on just kind of how it's not easy, but these are important elements. How about this question? Yeah, and anybody can chime in. Actually, why don't we stay on the capabilities a little bit longer?
Can I say something on influencing?
Great.
You know, beyond your
Great.
Your authority, because I really think that is of critical importance in terms of getting one's people to understand that. Because one of the great barriers I've found in the various organizations I've had involvement in one form or another in the last 10 years, which is a contrast in my experience within Arthur Andersen, was people whose first response to a problem is, it's not my job. If anything drives me crazy, it's not my job. And the one thing that I would do away with entirely in organizations is job specifications, because I think they're a curse. And developing that understanding amongst your people, I think, is provides the potential for a major breakthrough in their development. And so I would put great importance on that.
Great example. Super example. I remember a leader that I got to work with in the private sector used to say, you know what I like? I like people that look for the white space around their job and fill it, right? So it's the same point, just a little different way of saying it, right? And people are very different on this count, right? So no, these are the lines, and you know, others they're very entrepreneurial. It's a kind of entrepreneurialism, huh? It's like, look, I'm gonna fill that space. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
I would say just also on the capabilities you mentioned that something else as a leader, and in addition to influencing without authority, in a lot of cases the leader has the authority, yes. And I think it's important that leaders also influence with authority, and it kind of gets back to one of the examples of Conson's videos there of the authoritative leader who says at the outset of the discussion, I've got a choice, I've made a choice, or I have a candidate in mind, or what do you think? Which is, effectively stymieing the conversation at that point, because what are you going to say when this is your boss and how you're doing it? But how do you influence with authority so that you do step back a little bit and say, you know where you want it to go, and you know the candidate you want them to agree with you on, but you need to do it correctly and in a way that is over-inclusive.
Great point. Great point. One thing in my own experience that links to that. So at the business school, right? I mean, we have a strategic plan. Here's where we're going, and then something will pop up, right? And I will think, well, that's interesting. We'll have to think about it. And then one of the senior team will come up to me afterwards and say, so, does that completely undermine the strategic plan? And it's like, well, of course it's kind of like, if that's in people's minds, I need to say, we are still on track. This is where we're going. This does not change the main. But some people, it's kind of, oh, well, that could change everything. It's like, no, it doesn't, right? We may have to adjust, but we are on this path, right? And reminding people of that, because at the end of the day, right, it is your call. And so that was just one example where, things are getting muddled in people's minds. You don't even realize it. You have to, every once in a while, tell them, no, this is what we're still doing. Anyways, please. Anything else?
Look, I think the influencing without authority or with authority, I think, and also linking back to the speech earlier, at Goldman, we have the culture is really a bunch of leaders, everybody basically going for that white space in a pretty aggressive way. And so, especially as you get more senior in the organization, it becomes, influencing and trying to control a bunch of type A personalities, type A plus personalities, all wanting to lead is, I think, a fun thing to do and also a challenge.
Yes.
So, I think when you're a kind of quote unquote leader at Goldman Sachs, it's much more about enabling others to fulfill their potentials and take on as much responsibility as possible. So, in some cases it's lean back and let them run for things, and in some cases you need to come in and fix a problem between two conflicting leaders.
Yes.
So I'm not sure what the conclusion there is. It's a different organization to be a leader in, because you're kind of competing against a bunch of leaders in terms of influencing outcomes.
Yeah.
So.
Because there's not so much white space, but a lot of overlap, maybe. Or,
and look, in parts of our firm, we purposely have overlap, right?
Yep.
So there is no white space.
That's right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And the leader on top is trying to manage to make sure there's a healthy competition and conflict there, and so there is no white space. So we don't miss an opportunity. But at times there is a conflict either between those two groups or.
Yeah.
And that needs to be managed. So.
Yeah, great. Now we have probably about 7 or 8 minutes left. I want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions at the very least. One thing I wanted to put on the table, there's a wonderful leadership literature on transitions. The idea is that when you go through a transition, very different role, different function, right? That's when, it's often when we're hit with the most challenges because we're outside our comfort zone. It's also the time when we develop most rapidly, right? You might look back into your own career and think, boy, that 6-month period, I got like 3 years worth of development out of because I was really playing a different game. Any transition stories that come to mind for any of you when you were up against some challenges and you thought, wow, that was, I really kind of evolved a lot in that period?
I'm going through kind of a transition now, having left the corporate world and now setting up my own, basically, media advisory practice. And so any media companies out there that need any help with navigating the uncertainty of the media world, I'm happy to help. And looking at board positions or things like that, I can help you in a number of different ways. But it is it's an interesting time, and it a little gets back to what you were talking about earlier about the knowing, doing, being, for at some level it's about the being. Okay, so and my identity and who am I? And anytime you go through a process of changing a career or a transition like that, you do go through questions in your own mind, no matter where you are or what level you're at. You do have a lot of questions about who you are, what your identity is, and then getting back out there and reestablishing that. In the corporate environment, in the position I was in, I had it at some level and built it but it was by virtue of the corporate backing a senior title within the corporation. And suddenly out there on my own, yes, I've got a lot of contacts. I've built a particular reputation in the marketplace, but I'm also now reaching out to a whole community that I hadn't dealt with before in terms of talking to a lot of bankers, private equity, different players about how I can help, but now having to establish, well, who I am and what I can do to help them. But it gets to a lot of the characteristics and skill sets and qualities that you need within a leadership function within a big organization. It's the same thing when you're on your own, and you need the courage, you need the fortitude to stick with it, you need the resilience because you're knocking a lot of doors and nothing happens. And you need a lot of patience too, because it takes time to start building things up, and also for people to understand what you can do to help them.
Yep.
And
great example.
so it is a process I'm going through now, and it's fascinating.
Great example. Great example. Any other thoughts, please, Cliff?
Yeah, I mean, in my job, I'm going through a similar transition, where to the white space point. We had a person leave, and I've taken on a new sector that I'm covering. So I'm responsible for media and telecom.
Hard here.
And recently, a couple years ago, I took on internet as well. So now, and I hadn't done it that much in internet with internet companies, and so I had to go out and basically, learn business models, meet a ton of companies. There's probably, obviously, our focus area is probably taking those companies public at some point in time, and so meeting, somewhere between 30 and 50 small companies, and definitely a different approach to those companies. They're led by, younger entrepreneurs. They're fast growing. They don't really want to meet with investment bankers. They want to kind of grow their company and those type of things. And it's a big transition from the companies I covered before, which were, larger companies, financing, kind of, not growing quite as quickly and led by probably more established people. So kind of transitioning to a whole different approach to how do you kind of go out and meet and get to know 30 to 50 companies. And it involved a leadership challenge for me, which was actually getting some younger people below me to get inspired by the idea of covering these kind of new exciting companies, bringing them along and having them really play a leadership role with those companies, and kind of more overseeing that effort rather than actively doing it myself, which was kind of a fun challenge. And because the sector was so interesting, actually, it wasn't that difficult to get people to come and join me doing that. But
change in MO. Yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah.
It was a different approach.
Great example. I think we only have time for about one question, and I apologize. But anybody have a question they'd like to toss into the mix? We've got a microphone back there. Here's one right here. Thanks, Urs.
Yes, I have a question whether basically leadership is also a little bit a contextual situation issue. We now have probably the most interesting election coming up here in Europe, in Germany. And if you look who is the most influential politician here in Europe, it's Angela Merkel. And if you look how she leads, it's probably more on the experimental side, problem framing, than directional, because people cannot really catch her because she's like a fish. And it's very interesting that she's the most influential politician in Europe because nobody knows how to solve Europe. And in that sense, I think it really is a matter of the context you're in when one way of leader or one type of leader is more effective than another.
Great point. Great point. I don't know if anybody wants to comment, but
Well, she also has the biggest bank account too.
yes, that helps. But that notion of situational leadership, right? There is this long tradition of if there were one way to lead, we'd all know it, and so it is very contextual or situational. And that lots of writing in the leadership literature that leadership is at least three things. That leaders must simultaneously be strategic leaders, the direction setters, operational leaderships, the executors, right, and people leaders, kind of motivating people, ultimately putting teams together. I mean, the comments up here spanned all three of those areas. And so I want to thank our wonderful four panelists, and we will make sure that we stay on track here. So thanks to all of you. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.